My name is Claire Adeline Marsh. I am 34 years old. I'll start where most people don't. Not with the fight, not with the graduation, not with the moment my cousin Deanna stood up in front of 200 people and said what she said. I'll start with my grandfather's hands. Grandpa Roy had hands that looked like they'd been borrowed from a larger man. Wide-palmed, thick-fingered, brown from decades of Tennessee sun. He built furniture in the garage on weekends, not because he needed to, but because he said idle hands made a man dishonest. He smelled like cedar chips and Listerine. He called me Claire Bear until I was old enough to be embarrassed by it, and then he called me that even more. He died on a Tuesday in March, a week after my MBA graduation, and I'm almost certain he planned it that way to make sure I finished first. I grew up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, about 30 miles southeast of Nashville. My mother, Linda, was Roy's youngest daughter. My father, Dennis Marsh, left when I was 11, not dramatically but quietly, in the way some men leave, a slow withdrawal like tide going out. Until one morning his truck wasn't in the driveway and his side of the closet was empty, and my mother stood in the kitchen making oatmeal like nothing had changed, even though everything had. She never spoke badly about him, which I always thought was either saintly or its own kind of cruelty, because it left me no one to blame. So it was Grandpa Roy who stepped in. Not in a loud way, Roy wasn't loud about anything, but he showed up. He came to my school plays. He drove me to the SAT when Mom had a double shift at the hospital where she worked as an admissions coordinator. He sat at our kitchen table on Sunday afternoons and listened to me talk about books, about ideas, about all the things I was going to do someday, and he'd nod slowly the way he did and say, "Well, Claire Bear, sounds to me like you've got a plan." He had 4 grandchildren total. Me, my cousin Deanna, and Deanna's 2 younger brothers, Marcus and Tyler, who were sweet. Quiet boys who played baseball and became an electrician and a contractor respectively, and never caused a moment of trouble in their lives. Deanna and I were the oldest, born 18 months apart, and we were raised close enough to be almost sisters. Christmas Eves at Grandpa Roy's house in Smyrna. 4th of July cookouts in his backyard. Thanksgiving with the same mismatched folding chairs every year because Roy refused to throw anything away that still worked. Deanna was the kind of beautiful that made rooms stop. Dark hair, green eyes, a laugh that arrived before she did. Growing up, people always noticed her first. I learned early that this wasn't something to be angry about, it was just the weather, something you dressed for. I was quieter, more focused, the one with the color-coded binders and the 5-year plans. Deanna called me spreadsheet when we were teenagers affectionately, I think. We weren't close as adults. That happened the way distance usually happens, not from a fight but from geography and different rhythms. After high school, I went to University of Tennessee on a partial scholarship, waited tables the rest, graduated with a finance degree. Got a job in Nashville at a mid-size commercial real estate firm called Holloway & Partners. I worked there for 6 years, got promoted 3 times, and then applied to Vanderbilt's Owen Graduate School of Business, which was the thing I'd wanted since I was 22. Grandpa Roy cried when I got in, actual tears. He wiped them with the back of that big hand and said, "I always knew it." Deanna, meanwhile, lived about 40 minutes away in Brentwood with her husband Greg and their daughter Lily, who was 7. Greg sold medical devices and made good money. Deanna didn't work, which wasn't a judgment. She was devoted to Lily and active in the school's PTA and organized the neighborhood's 4th of July block party every year. She made it look effortless. She had a house that looked like a catalog and a life that photographed well, and for a long time I thought she was genuinely happy. I'm not sure when I stopped thinking that. The point is, Grandpa Roy died and he left me something, not a lot by most standards. Roy wasn't a rich man. He'd been a machinist for 30 years, retired on a modest pension, lived simply. What he had was a house, the house in Smyrna, a 3-bedroom ranch he'd bought in 1974 for $40,000, now worth, in the current market, somewhere in the neighborhood of $320,000. He also had savings, about $94,000 spread across 2 accounts, the legacy of a man who'd never bought a new car in his life and grew his own tomatoes. His will, written with a Murfreesboro attorney named Gerald Fitch, was clear. The house and its contents went to my mother, Linda, and to her sister Pam, Deanna's mom, in equal shares, with the understanding that they'd sell it and divide the proceeds. The cash savings, however, the $94,000 he left to me alone, with a handwritten note attached to the official documents that said, "For Claire's future, she knows what to do with it." Love, Roy. My mother told me about the will over the phone the week after he died. She was crying but trying not to. I sat on the floor of my Vanderbilt apartment and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and felt something large and complicated move through me that I didn't have a name for. Aunt Pam was on the call too. She was quiet. She said, "Roy always did love you special, Claire." And I heard something underneath it but didn't examine it because grief makes everything echo strangely. I didn't think about it again for almost 3 weeks. My graduation was in May, a Friday evening ceremony at Vanderbilt's Allen Arena, the kind of event with printed programs and a string quartet and parents crying in the bleachers. I'd invited my mother, my 2 closest friends from the program, Jasmine and Tom, and, because it felt right, family, which meant Aunt Pam and Deanna and Greg and Lily. I rented out a private room at a restaurant nearby for the dinner after. It felt like the right thing to do. Grandpa Roy wasn't there, which left a hole in the shape of him, and I thought gathering family might help fill it somehow. I should have trusted the instinct that said otherwise. In the weeks between Roy's death and my graduation, I was too focused on finishing finals, a capstone project. Job negotiations with a real estate development firm in Nashville that had recruited me out of a second-year internship, to pay much attention to the low-grade static coming from Deanna's direction. But it was there, if I'm honest. It started with a text. 3 days after we got the news about the will, Deanna sent me a message that said, "Hey, how are you holding up? This whole thing is so hard. Call me sometime," which was normal. I called her the next day. We talked for 20 minutes about Roy, about memories, about how strange it was to walk into his garage and smell the cedar and know he'd never stand there again. It was a good conversation, or I thought it was. But at the end she said, almost as an afterthought, "Mom mentioned the will, Roy's savings going to you specifically. That must be nice." Something about the word specifically landed wrong. I said, "It was a surprise. I think he wanted to support my degree." "Right," Deanna said, "of course." A pause. "It's just Greg and I have been really stretched lately. Lily's school, the mortgage. I'm not saying anything. I'm just, Roy was our grandfather too, you know." I said I understood. I said it must be hard. I did not say what I was actually thinking, which was that Roy's house, split between our mothers, would net Deanna's family something like $160,000. And that the 9 months of effort I'd put into the MBA had been partly with Roy's encouragement and explicit support, and that wills aren't accidents. I didn't say any of that. I said, "I know this is a lot to process." "It is," she said. And then her voice changed back to warm, and she said she was proud of me for finishing and she'd see me at graduation. I should have marked that conversation more carefully in my memory. I should have written it down. Instead, I finished my finals and negotiated my salary and planned a dinner reservation and thought about Grandpa Roy's hands. And I told myself family was complicated, but that we'd all be fine. I was wrong about that. The first thing I noticed at graduation was how Deanna looked at me. Not during the ceremony. During the ceremony, she clapped and smiled and took photos like everyone else. It was after, at the restaurant, during the dinner, that I caught it. Twice while I was speaking, telling a story about a finance professor who'd memorized every student's undergrad GPA and used it to cold call people at the most inconvenient moments. A funny story. People laughing. I looked at Deanna and she wasn't laughing. She was watching me with an expression I couldn't name, not anger exactly, something older and more patient than anger. Greg was quiet the whole dinner. Greg was usually easy, gregarious, the kind of guy who makes friends with the bartender, but that night he spoke when spoken to and spent a lot of time looking at his phone under the table. Aunt Pam was fine. Aunt Pam was always fine in public. She was the kind of woman who could manage her feelings in front of a crowd as a point of personal pride, same as Roy, actually. I think she learned it from him. Lily, Deanna's daughter, was beautiful and 7 years old and kept asking if she could have another breadstick, which was the only fully honest thing happening at the table. We got through the appetizers, we got through the entrees. My mother gave a little speech that made me cry. Jasmine said something funny. Tom talked about my terrifying organizational systems in a way that was an affectionate roast. I felt for most of it the way you want to feel at a celebration, held by the people who love you. And then dessert arrived and the room shifted. I don't know what made Deanna choose that moment. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe she'd been building toward it all evening and the dessert plates arriving felt like a natural pause, the way the end of a meal can feel like a closing argument. Maybe she'd planned it specifically for a moment when I was surrounded by people who mattered to me. She set down her champagne glass and said, "Can I say something?" Since we're all here, everyone looked at her. Deanna commanded attention naturally, rooms tilted toward her. "I've been thinking a lot about Grandpa Roy," she said. Her voice was measured, warm. The voice she used for PTA meetings. About what he meant to this family, and I've been thinking about his wishes, about making sure we honor him the right way. She looked at me directly. "Claire, I know the will gave you the savings. I'm not disputing that, She paused, pressed her lips together in a way that looked like she was organizing sorrow. "Roy loved all of us. He was all of our grandfather, and I think if you really thought about it, you'd agree that the money, some of it, not all of it, should be shared more fairly, as a family." The table went quiet. Not empty quiet, full quiet, the kind packed with things people are deciding whether to say. My mother had gone still in the way she went still when she was managing herself. Jasmine, who didn't know any of this backstory, was looking between us with careful eyes. Lily asked for another breadstick. I looked at Deanna across the table, across the flowers I'd picked out, in the restaurant I was paying for on the night of my graduation, and I thought of Roy's handwriting on that note. For Claire's future, she knows what to do with it. I thought she planned this, right here in front of everyone, and I thought she doesn't know what I know. I picked up my champagne glass and I smiled at her and I said, "This probably isn't the moment for that conversation, Deanna. But I'd love to talk another time." She nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she'd expected, like a chess piece sliding into a position she'd already anticipated. The dinner ended 40 minutes later. My mother hugged me extra hard in the parking lot and said quietly against my hair, "Don't you worry about that." I drove home alone. I sat in my car in my apartment's parking garage for a long time before I went inside. I was not angry yet, not exactly. What I was awake, the way you become awake when you realize something has been moving toward you in the dark and you've only just heard it. I got out my laptop. I opened a new document. I titled it Record, and I started writing down everything I could remember, every conversation, every comment, every look, the text after Roy died, the phone call. The words specifically, the pause before, of course. I wrote for 2 hours, then I saved it with a timestamp and I went to bed. Outside my window, Nashville hummed its ordinary sounds, traffic, a siren somewhere, the distant rumble of a freight train. I lay in the dark and thought about Grandpa Roy, about his hands building things in the garage, about how he'd said she knows what to do with it. I was starting to understand what he'd meant. What the records actually show: the Monday after graduation, I called my mother. I'd been awake since 5:30. Not anxious exactly, more like alert, the way you are when your body decides sleep is finished before your mind has caught up. I lay in the gray of my apartment for a while, listening to a garbage truck working its way down the block. And then I got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the document open on my laptop, reading back through what I'd written the night before. 11 pages, dates, times, words as close to verbatim as I could reconstruct them. The text after Roy died, that must be nice. The phone call, the pause before, of course. The dinner, the champagne glass, Deanna's PTA voice saying, "If you really thought about it." Reading it back in the pale morning felt different than writing it had. Writing it had been reactive, the release valve of someone who just absorbed something and needed somewhere to put it. Reading it was analytical. It was the act of a person who was beginning to understand the shape of a thing. I called Mom at 8. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been up for a while too. We talked for an hour. My mother had a way of discussing difficult things that I'd always admired. She kept her voice even and her words deliberate, the way someone keeps their footing on uncertain ground. She'd learned it from a life that had required steadiness, my father leaving the hospital, 20 years of being the person other people called in a crisis. She didn't panic. She processed and then she spoke. She told me not to take Deanna's comment personally. She used that word specifically, personally, and I thought about it because I wasn't sure the distinction held. It had been personal. Deanna had chosen a personal occasion and a personal audience and a personal framing. But I understood what Mom meant. Don't let it become something that lives under your skin. Don't let it metastasize into the kind of wound that alters how you move through the world. Pam has been talking, Mom said. For weeks, even before the dinner, she called me twice after the will reading. What did she say? A pause, Mom choosing her words. She said Roy had been, and this is Pam's word, influenced. In his final years, she said the closeness between you and Roy wasn't natural, that you'd cultivated it. I set my coffee cup down. I visited him, I sat at his table, I asked him how he was. I know that. That's cultivating. In Pam's story, yes. Mom's voice was quiet but precise. She needs a reason for the will to look the way it does. The reason she's landed on is you. I sat with that for a moment. Outside my kitchen window, a sparrow landed on the fire escape railing, considered something, and left. Is she going to contest it? I asked. Gerald says she doesn't have grounds. Roy was sharp, the will was properly witnessed, the note was attached. It would cost her money she doesn't have and she'd lose. Then what's the goal? What does she actually want? Mom was quiet again. This quiet was different, the kind that means someone is deciding how much to say. I think, she said finally, that Pam wants Deanna to get some of the money. And I think she's decided the best way to make that happen isn't through Gerald or through a courtroom, but through you. Through guilt. Through the idea that you'll decide family harmony is worth more than $94,000. Is that what you think I should do? I think, my mother said carefully, that Roy made his wishes clear, that he had his reasons, and that what you do with those wishes is between you and your own conscience. Which was not an answer. Which was, from my mother, a kind of answer. I'm not going to give the money away, I said. Not defensively, just as a statement of fact, the kind you make when you've already arrived at a conclusion and are just saying it out loud for the first time. Okay, Mom said, not surprised. Not relieved, just receiving it. Did Roy ever say anything to you about the money, about why he made the choice he made? The pause this time was longer. He said once, it was maybe 2 years ago, we were on the phone, not even talking about anything in particular. He said, Linda, some people show you they love you by asking what you need. Other people show you they love you by asking what you want. Claire always asks what I want. She paused, that's all he said. We moved on to talking about his tomatoes. I didn't say anything for a while. I'm going to handle this, I said. I know you are, Mom said. Just be careful. After we hung up, I sat with the empty coffee cup and the open document and that image of Roy's tomatoes, the ones along the south side of his house in Smyrna. Staked neatly with wooden posts he'd made himself, the ones that produced more fruit than he could ever use, so he'd bring bags of them to anyone who'd take them. He used to bring me 2 or 3 when I visited, warm from the vine. And I'd eat one standing in his driveway with the juice running down my wrist, and he'd watch me with that particular expression of a person who takes quiet pleasure in having made something. She always asks what I want. I opened a new tab and found the number for Gerald Fitch's office. He picked up himself, which surprised me. I'd expected a receptionist. His voice was the same as I remembered from the will reading, measured, southern in an old and unhurried way. The voice of a man who had spent 50 years being the still center of other people's storms. Miss Marsh, he said, I've been expecting you'd call. You said something last week, I said, about concerns Roy had mentioned about financial matters. I did. I'd like to know more. A pause. The sound of a file drawer, maybe, or a chair shifting. Roy was a private man. He didn't discuss his finances with most people. But he discussed them with me over the years because that's what you do with an attorney you trust. Gerald's voice was careful but not evasive. He mentioned more than once that he'd been asked for money by family, and that the asking was sometimes accompanied by reasons that didn't hold up over time. What kind of reasons? Medical emergencies that he later learned weren't quite emergencies. Business opportunities that produced no paperwork. Family situations that resolved without the money seeming to make a difference. I felt something settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, something more like recognition, the feeling of hearing something you already suspected confirmed out loud. Roy wasn't a suspicious man, Gerald continued. But he was a precise man. He kept records. He wrote things down. When something didn't add up, he noted it and he moved on, and he tried to think well of people. But he didn't forget. Did he leave the records anywhere? I asked. The notes he kept. He left them with me, Gerald said, in a sealed envelope. Addressed to you. I drove to Murfreesboro on a Saturday morning when the air already had the weight of a Tennessee summer building in it. The kind of heat that arrives before noon and settles into everything. Gerald's office was on a quiet street downtown, a brick building with a small brass plate by the door. He met me himself, showed me to a small conference room, and set an envelope on the table. It was a standard business envelope, sealed with tape, my name written on the front in Roy's handwriting, that compressed, precise script of a man who'd spent decades filling out forms, making measurements, keeping records. He'd pressed the pen down hard. The letters didn't waver. I opened it there at Gerald's conference table, with Gerald tactfully finding something to do in another room. 31 pages. Not typed, handwritten in the same compressed script as my name on the envelope, on lined yellow legal paper. Roy had organized them chronologically, each entry dated at the top, most of them half a page or less, a few longer. He hadn't editorialized much. He wrote what had happened, what had been said, what he'd observed, and occasionally, in parentheses, a brief note of his own. The parenthetical notes were the most Roy thing I'd ever read, restrained, dry, occasionally heartbreaking. The first entry was from 1998. Pam had called him asking for money. $12,000. She described it as a medical situation, something involving Greg's health, tests that needed to be run, bills that had come in. Roy had sent a check within the week because that's what Roy did, because someone he loved said there was an emergency and he believed them. He'd noted several months later a brief parenthetical, asked Pam how Greg was doing. She said fine, never had the problem they thought, did not mention the money. The next entry was 2001. $8,000, Deanna's college fund, Pam had said. Deanna was 16. The money would go into an account and grow. Roy had given it. 2 years later, when Deanna got into college and Roy asked about the fund, Pam said it had been used for something else, that things came up, that she was sure Roy understood. He'd written, I understand, I wrote it down. There were 6 more entries over the following decade. They had a rhythm to them that I recognized, not because I'd experienced it, but because I'd studied enough human behavior in business school to know the pattern. A request framed as urgent. A reason that invoked love or family or crisis, money transferred, and then silence where gratitude or repayment might have been. Followed eventually by the next request. The 2007 entry was Greg's business loan. Roy had written Greg says business, Claire would say lottery ticket beside it. The amount was $9,000. Greg had talked, apparently, about a distribution opportunity, a product he was going to represent, a territory that was opening up. Roy had given him the money because Greg was his grandson-in-law and Roy wanted to think well of people. The business never materialized. Greg never mentioned it again. Roy had written, a year later, did not bring it up, some things cost more to pursue than to release. I sat with that one for a long time. The 2014 entry was the one Roy had marked investment opportunity. Pam had heard about something, Roy wasn't sure what. He'd tried to ask clarifying questions and received what he described as the kind of answers that don't answer. He'd given $5,000. He'd written beside it, "I don't understand investments that require you to keep them secret, but she is my daughter and I am choosing to trust her." And then the last one, 3 years ago. $41,000. Roy had written this one at more length than the others, 3 full pages of his compressed script. He described the phone call from Pam in detail. She'd been emotional, he'd noted, more so than usual. She said Lily had been diagnosed with something. She was vague about what. She said the testing was expensive and the treatments would be more so, and that Greg's insurance had gaps and she didn't know where else to turn. Roy had asked for specifics. Pam had given him the name of a hospital, a general description of the condition, a number 41,000 that she said would cover the immediate phase of treatment. Roy had asked to see the bills. Pam had said she'd send them. He'd waited 2 weeks. He'd sent the money first because Lily was a child and he wasn't going to wait on paperwork when a child might need help. He'd written, "She is 7 years old. I cannot be the reason she doesn't get what she needs." But the bills never came. Roy had asked again, gently, in a phone call a month later. Pam said they were all paid now, the situation was resolved, Lily was doing much better. Wasn't that wonderful? Roy had said yes, of course it was. He'd hung up the phone and gone to his garage and built something. He always built something when he was managing feelings. His final note in the entry read, "I called Lily's school to ask about absence records the way a grandfather might." The secretary was kind. She said Lily had missed only 2 days in the last 3 months. I thanked her. "I don't know what to make of this. I am choosing not to make anything of it at this time. But I am writing it down." I read that 3 times. I sat in Gerald's conference room for a long time after I finished the 31 pages. Gerald came back eventually with a glass of water which he set beside me without comment, and then he sat in the chair across the table and waited. "The 41,000, I said. "Yes," he said. "Lily wasn't sick." "I don't know what Lily was," Gerald said carefully. "I know that the documentation Roy requested was never provided. I know that Roy made his own inquiries and was unsatisfied with what he found. I know that 18 months after giving that money, he came to this office and revised his will." I looked at the 31 pages on the table in front of me, Roy's handwriting. His careful, precise record of 30 years of loving a daughter who had used that love as a ledger. "He never confronted her," I said. "No, why not?" Gerald folded his hands on the table. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was when he was selecting the truest thing. He said that confronting her wouldn't give him his money back, and it wouldn't change who she was, and it would only damage the family. He said he wasn't interested in being right. He was interested in making sure the money he still had went somewhere it would do what he intended. I thought about Roy in his garage, building something. The cedar smell and the hum of his radio tuned to the country station he'd listened to his whole life. Managing his feelings with his hands. "He loved her," I said, "even after all this." "He did," Gerald said. "He wrote about that too. He said she wasn't a bad person. He said she was someone who'd learned that people who love you will give you things. And she'd stopped being able to see the difference between taking advantage of love and just receiving it." He said he felt sorry for her in the end. I drove home and I added everything to the document. I scanned each of the 31 pages, named them by date, saved them in 3 separate places: my laptop, a USB drive I put in my desk drawer, and a cloud folder. I was not panicking. I was not angry exactly, though anger was in there somewhere, a low, steady burn underneath the surface of everything. What I was mostly was awake in a new way. I understood now why Roy had designated that money to me specifically, and I understood it wasn't just because he believed in my future. It was because he'd trusted me to handle the truth of it. "She knows what to do with it." He'd handed me the whole picture, the 31 pages, the pattern, the 41,000, and he'd trusted me to know what to do if it came to that. I called Dana Hellman 2 days later. Jasmine had given me her number months ago after a dinner where I'd mentioned, vaguely, that a family situation was developing. Dana was 40-something, direct, with an office in Belle Mead and the particular quality of attention that good attorneys have. She listened the way some people watch. taking in everything without indicating what she was making of it. I explained the situation. I told her about the will, about the graduation dinner, about the coffee with Deanna, about the 31 pages. She let me go through all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do not confront anyone yet." "I know," I said. "I mean it specifically," she said. "Not Pam, not Deanna, not even your mother in the sense of asking her to intervene. What you have in those records is significant, but it's only leverage if it arrives as a surprise. If they know you have it, they can prepare. Right now, they think you're on the defensive. Let them believe that. They're going to push again," I said. "Deanna said she was going to talk to an attorney. Let her. The will is airtight. Gerald will tell any attorney she hires exactly what he told you, and there's no legal avenue available to them. What they're likely to do is keep applying social pressure, guilt, family events, your mother as an intermediary. That's their strategy because it's the only one they have." "How long do I wait?" She thought about it. "Give it until fall. The holidays make things complicated. But by fall, if they haven't made a formal move, they'll be looking for one final push. And they'll choose a moment that feels meaningful to them, a gathering, a family occasion. They'll want an audience." She paused. "When that happens, you want to be ready." "I will be," I said. "Don't just say that," she said, not unkindly. "Actually prepare. Have copies of those documents organized and accessible. Know exactly what you're going to say before you say it. Don't improvise in a moment like that." I said I understood. We talked for another 40 minutes about the specifics, what would and wouldn't be appropriate to share, how to frame the records as Roy's own documentation rather than an accusation, what to do if Pam threatened to make things ugly in ways that extended beyond the estate. When we hung up, I sat for a moment with my hands flat on my desk and breathed. July arrived in Nashville the way it always does, not gradually but all at once, heat wrapping itself around the city like a hand. I'd been at Meridian Properties for 3 weeks by then, and I'd found my footing faster than I expected, which was partly training and partly, I think, the strange focus that comes from having something large and unresolved running in the background of your life. When you're waiting for something, you tend to attend to everything else with unusual care. The 4th of July came and went. Meridian did a party on someone's rooftop deck in Germantown, with good food and a view of the fireworks over the river. I went with Jasmine and stood on the roof and watched the sky turn colors and thought, briefly, about Roy's backyard in Smyrna where I'd watched fireworks my whole childhood. And then I put that thought away and had another drink and talked about other things. Deanna texted me 3 days before the 4th. "Hey, hope you're settling in at the new job. Would love to grab coffee sometime and talk through some stuff. Family stuff, just us." I replied immediately, "Definitely. Let me know when works for you." She suggested Thursday. I said yes. I want to be precise about what I was feeling going into that coffee meeting because I think it matters. I wasn't afraid of Deanna. I wasn't angry at her, not the hot reactive kind of angry. What I felt was something more like clarity, the steady, quiet kind that comes when you stop pretending a situation is something other than what it is. I knew what Deanna wanted. I knew what I was going to say. The question was just how it would unfold, and I decided not to fight that part, to let it unfold however it wanted to. We met at a coffee shop in Brentwood with exposed brick and houseplants and that particular ambient music designed to be unnoticeable. Deanna was already there when I arrived. She looked good. She always looked good. Linen pants, a silk blouse, dark hair, and a low knot. She'd ordered already, oat milk and a latte, and she was looking at her phone when I came in but put it face down the moment she saw me, which was a kind of courtesy. We hugged. It was a real hug, not a performance one. Whatever else was true, Deanna and I had grown up together. The closeness of that history lived in the body in ways that didn't disappear just because things had gotten complicated. For 20 minutes we talked easily. She asked about the new job and I told her about the projects I was working on, a mixed-use development in Germantown that was more interesting than I'd expected. She talked about Lily, who had recently announced that she wanted to be an astronaut, which Deanna said she was taking seriously because Lily was the kind of child who meant everything she said. Greg was fine, the summer was busy. She'd redone the back patio. It was comfortable almost. It had the quality of the relationship we might have had if we'd been luckier, or if things had gone differently somewhere along the line. I felt the sadness of that briefly, like catching a reflection in a window and then it's gone. She set her cup down and said, "Okay, I'm just going to say it." "Go ahead," I said. I kept my voice even, interested even. $94,000 is a lot of money, she said. Greg and Lily's school situation is changing. She's going to test for the magnet program, and that's going to cost something. The mortgage, Greg's territory shifted and his commission structure changed, which basically means we're having to recalibrate the whole budget. She looked at her hands, then back at me. I'm not trying to take anything from you, I want to be clear about that. But I think, if Grandpa Roy could have seen all of us, the whole picture of everyone's lives and what we need right now, he might have made a different choice. I watched her face while she said this. She believed it, or she had convinced herself she believed it, which in practice amounted to the same thing. She had built a version of Roy in her mind, a Roy who would have, given all the information, made a different will. It wasn't cynical exactly. It was the way people protect themselves from feeling like they're asking for something they haven't earned. They rewrite the story until the ask feels like justice. "Do you know what Roy said to Gerald when he revised his will?" I asked. She blinked. "No, he said I was the only one who'd ever asked him what he wanted. He said everyone else told him what they needed." A silence. She looked at the window. A woman walked by outside pushing a stroller, the baby asleep, one sock about to fall off. "That's not fair," Deanna said. "I was busy, I had Lily, I had the house. I couldn't get down to Smyrna as much as you could." "I know," I said, and I genuinely did. "I'm not saying you didn't love him. I'm saying he made a deliberate choice with full knowledge of who we all were, and he made it clearly and carefully." She looked back at me. "Mom thinks you influenced him, that you were so present, so available. She thinks it shaped how he thought about everything." I looked at my own coffee cup, then at her. "Did you think that before Pam said it or after?" She didn't answer. That was its own answer. The unanswered question sat between us and we both felt its weight. I said as gently as I knew how, "Deanna, I'm not going to share the savings. I want to be honest with you about that right now so you're not waiting on something that isn't coming. Not because I don't care about you or your family, but because Roy made a legal decision with a clear mind and I'm going to honor it." She looked at me for a long time. I saw crossing her face something that I couldn't fully read. It was more than one thing at once. Frustration, yes, but also something underneath it, something that looked almost like relief. The relief of a person who'd been handed a script and is beginning to realize the script isn't going to work and can therefore stop performing it. "I'm going to talk to an attorney," she said. "That's absolutely your right," I said. "Gerald will be glad to walk their attorney through the will. It's clean." "Deanna," Roy was careful. She nodded. Not agreeing exactly. Receiving. We sat for another few minutes and talked about other things, the way you do when the real conversation has ended but no one wants to be the one to acknowledge it. She asked if I was seeing anyone. I said no. She said she thought Nashville was supposed to be good for that. I said I'd heard that too. We laughed briefly, genuinely, and then we said goodbye in the parking lot and I watched her drive away in her white SUV, and the afternoon light lay across the asphalt in long, late summer angles. I sat in my own car for a minute, then I drove home and I opened the document and I added everything. I had what I needed. I'd had it since that Saturday in Gerald's conference room. 31 pages in Roy's handwriting, 3 locations of backup copies, and a conversation with Dana that had given me the shape of what was coming. The question wasn't whether Deanna and Pam would escalate, they would. Pam was not a woman who accepted the first no as final. And she had too much invested, not just financially but narratively, the story she'd built about the injustice of the will. The story that required me to be the villain, to simply stand down. The question was when and where and who would be in the room. Dana had said they'll choose a moment that feels meaningful, a gathering, they'll want an audience. I filed that away. I kept working. I kept adding to the document, which had grown now to 22 pages, And I made a folder in my files called Roy, and I kept everything in it, organized by date, every document clear labeled. August passed September. The light changed the way it does in Tennessee in September, not the dramatic turning of New England, but something subtler and more southern, a softening. The harshness going out of the sun, while it was still technically warm. I started thinking about fall, about what a family occasion in fall looked like. Deanna's birthday was in October. Pam had historically hosted it. There would be people there, Deanna's friends, family, the kind of room that Pam knew how to work. I prepared. I organized the relevant pages from Roy's records into a folder I could carry with me. I spoke to Dana twice more, refining what I planned to say, making sure I could say it clearly and calmly and without trembling. Because I knew my own tendency to falter when something matters too much. I practiced in my bathroom mirror, which felt absurd and was also the most useful thing I did. I accepted the invitation to Deanna's birthday party. I bought her a book she'd mentioned once months ago in passing. She'd said she'd always meant to read it. I bought a bottle of champagne. I picked a dark green dress that I felt good in. I drove to Smyrna on a Saturday in mid-October, the hills on either side of the highway already going amber at the edges, and I carried the folder in my bag like something quiet and patient. Like a thing that had been waiting a long time to be seen. I was ready. Roy had taught me to measure twice before cutting. I'd measured more than twice. The moment came in October. I should have anticipated that Pam would choose a family event. It was entirely consistent with everything I knew about her. Pam had always understood that family gatherings were stages, that the right audience lent weight to a performance. That people behaved differently when they were being watched by people whose opinions mattered to them. She'd been doing it her whole life, orchestrating the conditions under which things got said. It was Deanna's birthday party, her 36th. Held at Pam's house in Smyrna on a Saturday afternoon in mid-October when the Tennessee hills had gone amber and rust, and the air smelled like leaves in someone's chimney 2 streets over. I almost didn't go. I'd been weighing it all week. Dana had said let things play out naturally, and showing up felt natural. But not showing up felt like retreat, and I wasn't in retreat. I went. I brought a book Deanna had mentioned once wanting, a bottle of champagne, and I wore a dark green dress I felt good in, because if you know you're walking into something, you might as well walk in standing straight. Pam's house was full when I arrived. Deanna's friends from the neighborhood, women from the PTA, neighbors who'd known Pam for decades. Marcus was there with his wife Angela, Tyler with Renee. My mother had come from Nashville. I didn't know until I walked in and spotted her across the living room. She gave me a single look, one lifted eyebrow, that meant be ready. My mother could communicate entire paragraphs with her face. Lily ran at me within 30 seconds. She was 8 now, an inch taller than Spring, and currently in a phase of absorbing everything knowable about the solar system. She wrapped her arms around my legs with the uncomplicated force of someone who didn't know things were complicated, looked up at me and said with great seriousness, "Did you know Saturn's rings are mostly made of ice?" "I didn't know that," I said. "Some pieces are as big as a house," she said. Then she ran off to find the dog. The party was warm and good for an hour. Pam's chili, cornbread from a cast-iron skillet, a peach cobbler still faintly warm from the oven. Whatever else was true about Pam, she cooked with real love, and the house smelled like every good October of my childhood. I talked to Marcus about a historic building he was rewiring downtown. I talked to Renee about her garden's unreasonable zucchini output. I talked to 2 women from the PTA whose names I didn't catch but who loved Deanna clearly and genuinely, which made me glad. Pam found me early. She hugged me and said she was glad I'd come, and both things were true. The hug and the gladness were real, and so was the subtext beneath them. The quiet satisfaction of a woman who'd wanted me exactly here. Greg wasn't drinking but looked like he wanted to be. Deanna thanked me for the gift and said we'd catch up properly. There was something slightly removed about her that afternoon, a quality of watching and waiting that I recognized because I'd been wearing it myself for months. The chocolate cake arrived. We sang. Lily sang the loudest by considerable margin. and when Deanna blew out her candles, Lily immediately asked whether birthday wishes were scientifically verifiable, which made the whole room laugh in the way that only a child who means everything she says can produce. I laughed too. I wasn't pretending. And then, after the plates were cleared and glasses refilled and the room had settled into the loose ease of a party past its peak, Pam moved to the fireplace. "Can I say a few words?" she said. "Since we have everyone together." The room tilted toward her. She knew how to do that, how to call for attention without demanding it, how to make people feel invited rather than summoned. I set my champagne flute on the side table. I kept my hands loose. I breathed just while we have family and the people who know Deanna best. Her voice was warm, modulated, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed without appearing to. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since we lost Roy, about what he'd want for this family, about legacy and what that word really means." She looked at me, briefly but directly. "Roy left things the way he left them," she said. "And I've never wanted to make this about money, but I genuinely believe Roy would have wanted his family taken care of equally. I think there were things he didn't fully understand, toward the end, about our circumstances. And I think, if we're the family he raised us to be, we can have an honest conversation about making sure everyone is okay." She was good. She had taken a demand and dressed it in Roy's name, in family, in the language of love and legacy. She had made me, without naming me, the obstacle between this family and the peace Roy would have wanted. The room was very quiet. The women from the PTA looked uncertain, sensing something they didn't have the full map of. Marcus was watching his mother. Tyler's wife Renee was looking at the floor. My mother was looking at me. Deanna was looking at her champagne flute, turning it slowly in her hands. Her face was arranged into careful neutrality. She had known this was coming and was not entirely comfortable with it. I let the silence sit. 1 beat, 2, 3, I counted them, then I said calmly, "I'd like to respond to that." Pam's expression shifted, just a brief tightening around the eyes. She'd expected deflection, another "this isn't the moment." She hadn't built the room around me saying yes. "Of course," she said. I reached into my bag. I took out the folder. Plain manila, nothing dramatic. I set it on the side table beside my champagne. "I want to say first that I loved Grandpa Roy," I said. "I think everyone who knew him did. And I believe he understood exactly what he was doing when he made his will." I looked at Pam steadily. "Roy kept detailed financial records going back to 1998. 31 pages, handwritten, meticulous, exactly what you'd expect from a man who dated his pasta sauce and measured twice before cutting. He left those records with Gerald Fitch sealed in an envelope addressed to me. I've read all of them." The quality of the room's silence changed. The same quiet but different in texture, the tight, held stillness of people realizing they're in the middle of something they didn't know was coming. "What those records show is that over 15 years, Roy gave $62,000 to this side of the family." I held Pam's gaze. "Loans and gifts to you and to Greg, most was never repaid. Several transactions were justified to Roy with reasons that turned out, over time, not to be accurate." Pam opened her mouth. I continued, evenly, "The last one I want to talk about specifically. 3 years ago, $41,000. Given because Roy was told it was for Lily's medical care, that she was sick, that tests and treatment were needed, that insurance wouldn't cover it." The room had gone completely still. I could hear the furnace cycling somewhere in the house. "Roy asked for the medical bills," I said. "He sent the money first because the person who was supposedly sick was 7 years old and he wasn't going to wait on paperwork. Then he waited for the documentation. It never came." I opened the folder. I tabbed the page. I read from Roy's handwriting just this once because Roy deserved to be in the room. He wrote, "I am choosing not to make anything of this at this time, but I am writing it down." I closed the folder. 18 months after that, he went to Gerald's office and revised his will. The furnace cycled off. The room held its breath. Lily appeared in the doorway to the hallway, stuffed animal in hand, reading the room with the alert attention of a child who knows something important is happening. Deanna saw her at the same moment I did. She stood quietly, went to the doorway, said something soft into Lily's ear. Lily looked once more at the room, at me, at her grandmother, at the assembled faces, and let her mother guide her back down the hall. A door closed gently. Deanna returned to her seat. She looked at me and I saw in her face that she knew. Whatever Pam had told her or hadn't, she understood now that something in that folder was going to change things. Marcus said quietly from across the room, "Mama," not a question, a verdict. "It was complicated," Pam said. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. Not small, Pam didn't do small, but smaller. Roy didn't understand everything, she said. He didn't always have the full picture of what we needed, what our life actually cost. "Did you take money from Grandpa under false pretenses?" Marcus said. Silence. Tyler stood up from the couch. He was built like Roy, wide through the shoulders, quiet by nature, the kind of man who means everything he says. "Was Lily sick?" he asked. Pam pressed her lips together. She looked at her sons, at the women from the PTA studying their plates with the focused intensity of people who desperately wish they were somewhere else. "There were concerns," Pam said. "There were things the doctors wanted to look at. It didn't end up being what we thought." "So she wasn't sick," Tyler said. "I don't think this is—" "Was she sick, Mom?" A long silence. "The kind that makes a room smaller." "Not the way I described it," Pam said. The admission landed and stayed. Deanna made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She was sitting very straight in her chair, champagne flute still in both hands, eyes bright, jaw set against something she was managing to keep inside. She was doing what Pam had taught her, managing in public, holding the surface together even when everything underneath was shifting. "I didn't know about the money," she said. To the room, not to Pam, not to me, to all of it. "I didn't know about any of it." "I believe you," I said. She looked at me. Something in her face broke briefly, then gathered itself back. "I don't think you're a bad person," I said. Not to Pam, to Deanna. "I think you were handed a story and you believed it because the person who told it loved you. But it wasn't the whole story." Pam tried once more. She was not a woman who surrendered without a final attempt. She offered a reframe. The money had been different than Roy described. He'd never fully understood their circumstances. She'd always meant to repay it. Things had been harder than anyone realized. She was composed even now, even while her sons looked at her with new and uncertain eyes. Performance had been her protection for so long that she reached for it automatically, even when the room had already left her. But the room wasn't with her. I could feel that shift, the particular change when the person speaking has lost the faith of the people listening. Marcus said quietly, "We'll talk at home, Mama." Not gentle, not cruel. Just the sentence that ends a chapter. I stayed another 20 minutes. I did not leave dramatically, that wasn't the point. The point wasn't to win and exit. I got a glass of water. I sat with Tyler for a few minutes, and we talked around the edges of things in the careful way of people navigating around something large. Renee touched my arm when no one was watching and said nothing but meant something by it. One of the PTA women found me by the drinks table. She said quietly, "I'm sorry." That was a lot to happen at once. "It was," I said. "She seems like a good person," the woman said, meaning Deanna. "She is," I said, and I meant it completely. I found Lily before I left. She'd come back out once the room returned to something resembling normal, and she showed me a drawing she'd made of Saturn, the rings labeled in careful block letters, ice and rock. I told her it was scientifically accurate. She looked deeply satisfied. Deanna was on the back deck. I saw her through the sliding glass door, standing with her arms wrapped around herself, looking out at the yard. The October light was coming through the trees at that late afternoon angle, golden and horizontal, catching the top of her dark hair. I stood at the door for a moment. I wanted to go out. She was my family. She had been my family longer than almost anyone still living. But she needed to be alone with it first. There are things you have to be inside alone before you can be inside them with another person. I understood that from my own long months of carrying something that required privacy before it could become language. I left. I drove home in the October dusk, windows down, the air cool and smelling like the season turning. I felt emptied, not light, not victorious. Emptied in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down. The weight was gone. What remained was just the shape of having carried it. I thought about Roy in his garage. The cedar smell, the radio on low, his hands on whatever he was building that week, writing down every dollar in his compressed, careful script. Noting when the reasons didn't hold, choosing not to make anything of it at this time, going on loving people who had used his love as a resource, because that was the nature of what he had. It didn't require reciprocity to continue. He'd left me the record, the map of the truth, trusted me to know what to do with it and when and what it would cost. She knows what to do with it. I'd known or I'd learned, I'm still not sure which. The weeks after were fractured, as I'd expected, and quieter than I'd hoped, and eventually something that looked, at least from a certain angle, like repair. Pam called my mother twice in the 10 days following the party. My mother listened both times. She said I understand in the tone that means she was receiving information without agreeing with it, which was its own kind of mercy. She told me only the outlines, not because she was hiding things, but because Pam was her sister, 60 years between them, and whatever Pam had done, that history didn't evaporate. Marcus called me on a Tuesday evening 2 weeks later. I was at my kitchen table annotating a project report, and his name on my screen surprised me. He sounded tired. The tiredness of someone who has recently had to rearrange what they believe to be true about someone they loved. I've been having some conversations with my mother, he said. Okay, I said. She's not going to admit it fully, I think you understand that. I do, but I want you to know that I know, he said. That Tyler knows that we talked and we're both, he stopped, gathered. I'm sorry that you had to bring those records into that room. I'm sorry Roy had to keep them at all. I pressed my thumb against my eyes. I hadn't expected to cry and I didn't quite. You don't have to apologize for your mother, I said. I know I don't have to, he said. I want to. We talked for 20 more minutes. He told me his mother had come closer to acknowledging the truth than she'd ever done in public, not all the way, but closer. He said she wasn't a bad person. He said it the way someone says something they need to believe and also actually believe, both at once. I know she's not, I said, and that was true. Pam was someone who had learned that love was a resource to be managed, and she'd been doing it so long she'd stopped experiencing it as a choice. That didn't make it right. But it made it human in the way a lot of painful things are human, not monstrous, just small and repeated until it became large. Tyler texted that weekend, "You did the right thing." Roy would be glad. He sent it at 7 in the morning, which meant he'd been up early thinking. I wrote back, "Thank you." He would have been glad it's over. Tyler replied, "Yeah, that was all." That was enough. My mother and Pam didn't speak for 6 weeks, the longest silence between them in 50 years, my mother said. Then in December they talked for 2 hours, and afterward Mom described it as difficult and honest and unfinished but real. Real, she said, was better than comfortable. Deanna texted me in November. A gray, rainy Saturday, the kind of late fall Nashville day that feels like the city turning inward. I was at my kitchen table with coffee and a book I wasn't really reading. "Hey, can we talk?" "Yes," I wrote. "Call whenever you're ready." She called in 10 minutes. She cried at the beginning, not dramatically. She'd been raised with the same managed composure, but her voice broke when she said my name, and I heard her working to steady it, and I just waited. Without filling the silence, without rushing her toward the part where she felt better, when she was steadier, she said, "I've been sitting with this for a month." "I know," I said. "I talked to my mother about the 41,000. She gave me a version, not Roy's version. A version where it was mostly true but just mishandled." "What did you make of that version?" A silence. "I thought it was the version she needed it to be," Deanna said quietly. "I don't think it's what actually happened." "No," I said. "She's my mother," she said. The words carried everything they contained, the love and the grief of it, the specific heartbreak of seeing clearly someone you're not able to stop loving. "I know she is," I said. We sat with that. Both of us holding the complexity, loving someone who has done something you can't quite excuse. Knowing the love and the knowledge have to coexist because there's no version where one of them disappears. Then she said, I stood up at your graduation dinner in front of your friends. I asked you to give me money in public on purpose. Yes, I said. I told myself I was being brave, she said. I was doing what she needed me to do, and I dressed it up as bravery so I'd feel okay about it. You believed the story she gave you, I said. That's not the same as being dishonest. It's close enough, she said. Maybe, I said, but you're here now, that counts for something. She asked what I was going to do with the money. I told her most into a long-term account the way Roy would have approved. A portion to the Habitat chapter in Smyrna in his name. She was quiet for a moment. That's exactly right, she said softly. He always said a man should leave a neighborhood better than he found it. He said it all the time, I said. I'd forgotten he said that, she said. We talked for another half hour. About Lily, about the holidays, about what the family would look like now, not resolved, just talked through. The way you talk through things when you're two people who have known each other their whole lives and are trying to figure out what that means in a new and rearranged version of things. When we said goodbye, she said, I'm glad you came to the party. Me too, I said, even with all of it. Especially because of all of it, I said. It needed to happen somewhere. The Habitat donation was formalized in February. A small ceremony at the chapter office in Smyrna. I'd expected something administrative, but they made a brief occasion of it, a framed certificate, an acknowledgement. The naming of a contribution toward a house being built on the east side of town. The plaque read, in memory of Roy Aldiss Hendrick, who believed in leaving things better than you found them. My mother came. Pam came too. I hadn't known until I arrived and saw her on the sidewalk in a gray coat beside my mother. When she saw me, she nodded once. I nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was two people acknowledging each other across a complicated history, which might be the most honest form of peace available between people who have hurt each other without quite meaning to. Deanna stood beside me during the ceremony, close enough that our arms touched. When it was done, she said, he'd have been embarrassed by the plaque. Deeply, I said. He'd have said it was too much fuss. And then he'd have been secretly pleased, I said. Absolutely, she said. We smiled at the same time, the same smile almost, I noticed that. The product of growing up in the same rooms, laughing at the same man. Lily had come. She stood holding her mother's hand during the ceremony with the focused gravity she brought to things she'd decided mattered. And afterward she told me that the house being built would have a kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a yard, and that someone was going to live in it, and she thought that was good. Me too, I said. She thought about this seriously. Do you think Grandpa Roy knew someone would live in it? I think that's exactly what he was thinking about, I said. She seemed satisfied. She went to find the patient beagle someone had brought, who had been sitting on the grass with the weary dignity of a dog who has attended many events. We ate lunch after at a diner on the main road, the whole family around a long table, the kind where someone always has to sit sideways because the chairs don't quite fit. Marcus and Tyler argued about the Titans with total conviction and zero resolution. Renee knocked over her sweet tea and the owner brought enough napkins to dry an ocean. Pam made a joke that didn't quite land and looked briefly embarrassed and then moved on, which was the most human I'd seen her in years. My mother laughed her real laugh, the one that arrives suddenly and sounds like it surprised her, the one I hadn't heard enough of recently. I ate my pie, buttermilk, right choice. I held my coffee with both hands because the diner kept it 10 degrees cooler than necessary, and I looked around the table at all of it, the noise and the imperfection and the specific. Stubborn beauty of people who have been through something hard and are choosing still to show up and share a meal. This is what I didn't fully understand until that year. It's not the good days that make a family. It's the days after the hard ones. It's the showing up when showing up is complicated, the sitting at the table when the table has been the site of things you'd rather not remember. It's Pam's joke that doesn't land and Tyler's sports argument and Lily explaining house square footage to anyone who will listen. It's the ordinary noise of people who have hurt each other and are still here, still passing the salt. Still choosing each other in the small repeated ways that matter more than the large dramatic ones. Roy had known this. He'd sat at tables like this one his whole long life, through things that fractured and things that slowly healed, and he just kept showing up. He hadn't required the people he loved to be perfect. He'd written down when they weren't, and then he'd passed the green beans and moved on. That was the thing about him. He loved people enough to see them clearly and clearly enough to keep loving them anyway. He gave me that. It is the best thing he left. Outside the diner window, Smyrna went quietly about its February life, unhurried and unbothered by the cold. Down the street on the east side of town, a foundation was being poured for a house where someone would eventually stand at a kitchen window on an ordinary morning, watching the yard come to light. Roy Aldi's Hendrick's name was on a plaque a few blocks from where he was born. He would have been embarrassed. He would have been glad. I finished my coffee. I was 34 years old. I had a folder on my laptop called Record that I would never need to open again. I didn't delete it. I don't think I ever will. Some things you keep not because you'll use them, but because they're true, and the truth of them is part of who you became. The light through the window was February thin, pale and clean and patient, the kind that comes just before spring starts making promises. It fell across the table and across all our different faces, and it didn't distinguish between us. It touched everyone the same.